It's January of 2013. A reporter from The Guardian named Laura Poitras, who's struggling to make her ends meet, enters a musty room in the Mira Hotel of Hong Kong. When she steps through the door, the sharp stench of Chinese takeout hits her. Behind the takeout boxes and scattered clothing sits a relatively good-looking man, albeit slightly disheveled. Little does Poitras know that she is standing in front of the very person who is about to become the greatest threat to American national security. Although he never discloses his real name, his identity is listed under the code name of Cincinnatus, who's a 30-year-old employee at the National Security Agency, supposedly on medical leave in Hong Kong, but in reality, fleeing from the US government. His laptop contains 60 gigabytes of the top government secrets, and he's about to share it all with Laura. In the following months after their rendezvous, public editorials leak the information to the rest of the world. Information that reveals how the government actually runs and treats its people. One of these public platforms is a rogue international media organization run by a man who the US government was trying to track down and put behind bars for 175 years because of what he had done. The stories of these two men, and whatever the US government decides to do with them and the impact that they have caused, could redefine and even destroy America's most coveted freedoms. Who were these two men? What did they do to become two of the greatest threats to the most powerful country in the world? And what does this mean for the future of the United States? And what does this mean for you? These are the cases of Julian Assange and Edward Snowden. On October 4th, 2006, an unknown 35-year-old Australian hacker named Julian Assange made a website called WikiLeaks. It was, and still is, a public site that has no location or aligns to any sort of government. Its only purpose was to give people a platform to anonymously publish sensitive government info that people thought needed to be out there for the sake of truth and transparency. For the first few years of its existence, WikiLeaks stayed under the radar. I mean, people were still uploading pretty serious documents, like this one file about the assassination order of Somali government officials, but its efforts went largely unnoticed. But that all changed on October 22nd, 2010, the day that Assange became one of the most dangerous enemies to the US government.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
Around this time, the US was involved in a war against terrorism in Iraq. On the front lines was an Army intelligence analyst by the name of Chelsea Manning, at the time known as Bradley Manning. Sick and tired of the horror that she saw in the Iraq war, she decided to do something about it. And with the help of Julian Assange, she hacked into government computers and uploaded nearly 750,000 classified documents and published all of them on WikiLeaks. This was the biggest leak in history, and it sent the media into a frenzy.
Of course, our top story this morning, the White House blasting the release of over 90,000 U.S. military records.
This leak could put the lives of Americans at risk and threaten our national security.
This guy's a traitor, a treasonous.
He has to answer for what he has done.
They became known as the Iraq and Afghan war logs, and they revealed how the U.S. actually conducted its wars, and it wasn't pretty. By taking a look at just a few of the files, you can see why the government wanted to hide this from the public. This is one of the more famous leaks. It's a video taken from an American Apache helicopter flying over an Iraqi family and two Reuters journalists. What happens next is, well, see for yourself. That is, in fact, a camera, not a weapon.
Light them all up. Come on, fire. Oh, it's their fault for bringing their kids to a battle. That's right.
About a month after the leak, Assange was accused of rape and sexual assault by two Swiss women who happened to be volunteers helping to run WikiLeaks, and Assange was ordered to be brought to a Swedish court for his trial. But something seemed off about this. Assange, who denied this ever happening, suspected that someone was behind all of this, and it wasn't actually about the charges. Specifically, he feared that this was actually an attempt to send him to Sweden to get him to the UK and then extradited to the US to be punished for what he had done. And in 2011, a London magistrate's court ordered his extradition to Sweden. Assange tried to appeal the decision, but it didn't work. So in June of 2012, he fled to the Ecuadorian embassy in London, seeking political asylum and shelter. If he stepped 1 foot out of the embassy, he would be arrested and locked up in a British cell to be tried and potentially sent to the US for prosecution. And Assange's retreat to the embassy wasn't a small thing either. The entire world knew what was at stake here, especially the British government. I mean, just look at this. Numerous police officers standing just outside the doors of the embassy, playing the waiting game with the man inside. So Assange just played along, and he holed himself up in the embassy for what seemed like could go on for years, appearing to be an unending stalemate between the powers of government and a single man. But if you cut off the head of the Hydra, 2 more must take its place. And it wouldn't be long until another player entered the scene.
Edward Snowden, for a time under the name Cincinnatus, was an employee at the National Security Agency. He was a dual citizen of both Russia and the US. And while he was working at the NSA, he had become incredibly disheartened at their dismissive attitude toward respecting civilian privacy. He began to consider the NSA to be the traitors of the Constitution. During the Cold War, Truman had created the NSA to encourage foreign surveillance of the Soviet Union and China. The 1950s were a period of incredible paranoia, and this was used as an excuse by many countries to establish widespread espionage on their international rivals. When the 1970s rolled around, however, the rights revolution took center stage in the US. These protesters advocated for an increase in personal freedoms, and inevitably, the NSA came under spotlight for potential violations of privacy. In response, the FISA, or Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978, was passed, specifying that the NSA could only spy on foreign powers, and that in order to carry out spying on domestic actors, it would require the unanimous consent of the FISA court. They also put in really arbitrary measures to restrict the NSA's powers, such as how the NSA was only allowed to investigate up to 3 hops or 3 social circles from its targets. But this didn't really mean anything because 3 hops is a lot of people. Just look at this diagram right here. 3 hops from 1 person is more than 25,000 people. So when Snowden came along in 2013, mass surveillance was no secret. However, public outrage had been suppressed because there appeared to be a balanced system of checks and balances between the government and the people. But before we get into exactly what he did, let's discuss why did he do it. Well, first, Snowden believed that the NSA's mass surveillance programs in the name of counterterrorism was a violation to the 4th Amendment, which states, "The rights of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause." Snowden couldn't get over that guilt of disobeying the Constitution, and he knew he had to do something about it. So in 2013, Snowden met with Laura Poitras at the Mira Hotel and released massive amounts of information that would change the definition of free press for eternity to come. The most groundbreaking of them all was the NSA's PRISM program. The PRISM program bought metadata from private corporations such as Apple, Google, Skype, and most famously Verizon, who had provided the US government with the communication records of millions of Americans. This would include information such as the duration, time, and location of their calls. The NSA responded that they had used these surveillance programs to defend the country from cyberterrorism, defend against Mexican drug cartels, and help break up criminal gangs, so this was all perfectly necessary for US national security. But what really was the tipping point for millions of Americans was Snowden's second piece of evidence. The second piece of evidence revealed that the FISA Act, which Americans had trusted to protect their individual liberties, was basically meaningless. Firstly, the NSA had not obeyed their three hops rule at all. Second, the FISA court was basically a puppet of the government. You see, this court did not have a jury and consisted only of government workers, away from all sources of public accountability. Snowden revealed that this incredibly biased court had barely vetoed any surveillance program since its creation. It had secretly made it constitutional to keep the data of US citizens for up to 5 years and exchange these data with its allies abroad. And with this, America's faith in democracy had absolutely shattered into pieces. It didn't take long for the US to charge Snowden for violating the Espionage Act of 1917 and theft of government property. They had cancelled Snowden's American passport, but Snowden did have a Russian naturalization citizenship as backup. Going to Russia and begging for Putin's mercy was the only way out of court trial, and eventually, jail. Julian Assange's colleagues actually accompanied Snowden to Russia, and Assange himself even encouraged the Ecuadorian government to grant Snowden asylum in their country. Snowden ended up escaping to Russia just in time, where they forced him to stay at an airport for 39 days before renewing his citizenship and granting him asylum in their country. Snowden now lives in a small Russian town, and a majority of his activism has largely subsided.
Now, let's head back to Julian Assange. Where we left off, he was still holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy in London in the year 2012, the only walls protecting him from what could be the end of his life. But as the years went by, Assange's psychological state gradually deteriorated. He became anxious and temperamental, and it was only a matter of time before he would be kicked out. And in 2019, that's exactly what happened. For the last 5 years, Assange has been sitting behind bars as his trial unfolds, and his fate is determined by the courts. At best, he would be sent to Australia for trial and possibly even acquittal. At worst, he would be sent back to the United States, where he would receive either a life or death sentence. But what exactly is the US government charging Assange with? On May 23, 2019, the US government released a statement detailing the 18 charges against Julian Assange, amounting to a total of possibly 175 years in prison. One of the counts is a violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act of 1986, which essentially states that you can't access unauthorized government files, which is self-explanatory. The remaining 17 counts mentioned multiple violations of the Espionage Act. The Espionage Act was a law enacted all the way back in World War I, which mandated that you can't obtain, disclose, or receive unauthorized information on national defense with the intent to hurt the United States. The prosecutors are saying that Assange's actions risk serious harm to the United States' national security to the benefit of their adversaries. But where is the intent? The law says that the prosecutors must be able to prove beyond a doubt that Assange was trying to hurt the United States and benefit another nation. But such evidence has yet to be found. Essentially, what the US government is trying to say is that Assange published unauthorized documents, and that is not allowed. So the crime here is publishing. That could have massive implications for the entire news industry and, more importantly, our First Amendment rights. Individuals with secret information that they think should be leaked to the public can disclose the content to news sources on the condition of anonymity. This happens all the time, and not only does it protect those involved, it also keeps the powerful in check. Punishing Assange for leaking the Iraq and Afghan war logs is the same thing as punishing the New York Times for publicizing the Pentagon Papers, a Supreme Court ruling that sided with the Times. In the New York Times versus the United States government, the Times published stolen files regarding U.S. activity in Vietnam, revealing deplorable acts and shocking the public. The government tried to cover this up and took the Times to court, where the newspaper's decision was deemed legal. Through this historic court case, American trust in the government declined, and many other things were revealed. The need for a free press to keep government in check, and the non-transparent nature of the government itself. At the same time, though, we must consider national security. While Assange may not have had the intent to harm the United States, it had that effect nonetheless, and the United States has to protect itself during hard times. Congress has repeatedly declined the press the ability to check government power for this very reason. The line must be drawn somewhere, and Julian Assange just so happened to be on the wrong side. But perhaps this destruction of national security is a necessary sacrifice for American politics to take one step forward. After Snowden's release of NSA surveillance documents, America's legitimacy as a democracy was harmed in all aspects. Public trust declined drastically. Private communication companies began to encrypt their code so that the government couldn't hack into it. And internationally, many world leaders began to refuse visits to the US in fear of American surveillance. To many countries, the US is at the same level of individual liberty as Xi Jinping's Chinese Communist Party. Although this was a major blow to the concept of US hegemony, it was a huge wake-up call for democracy. In this case, public outrage upon Snowden's document release had been the lever to transition to a world of greater press freedom. In the United States versus Mullen court case in 2020, the Supreme Court ruled that FISA's telephone intelligence programs were unconstitutional to the rights of individual privacy. Now that we've thoroughly established what the problem is, it is important to discuss the lasting legacy and themes surrounding the situation. Both champion freedom of press and privacy rights, becoming akin to heroes for much of the public body. However, their actions admittedly violated foundational government legislation and posed a direct threat to national security. What then is the message? Well, there are really two ways to look at this. Legally, what Assange and Snowden did, hacking into government files and distributing classified information, is very wrong and harmful. Morally, however, their actions were justified and beneficial to the public, of which a democracy is dedicated to serve. While the actions of both men undeniably threw the world into controversy regarding government transparency, freedom of press, and privacy, these are necessary arguments that must be addressed in order to iron out the system and help establish long-term benefits. As participants of democracy, it is our job to make educated decisions and determine our individual beliefs on such an important issue that may shape the very future of our nation.